does the template and the class, how do they know about each other? So how do we essentially zip these two together so that a template and a class at runtime comes together and they can make sweet, sweet music together? Well, this is done via metadata. And this allows Angular to process the class, process the template, and put these together into kind of a single coherent unit. And we attach this metadata via TypeScript using decorators. And this is, I think, prior to going all in on TypeScript, that this idea of using annotations or decorators to establish or extend some kind of like meta intent is not new at all. Like Spring and Java frameworks and different things have used this, but it didn't really exist in JavaScript. And I think even the Angular team was going to create, I think they were going to call it @script or something. Thank God they did not. But they realized that TypeScript already had an implementation of decorators. And so, in my opinion, this is probably one of the big reasons why we moved to TypeScript. Now, one thing to mention, again, this is one of these like hashtag pro tips, is that these decorators, they are just functions. And so when you define a decorator or some kind of metadata that, and this happens a lot with like input or output, is I'll forget to put the function call in there. So those are the parentheses. As a result, it just doesn't work. So do keep in mind that they are just functions, which means if you wanted, you could very easily create your own custom decorators, and that's not hard to do. So the most common is @component decorator that takes a number of configuration options that tells Angular, just like ng module, this is how we want to attach, or this is how we want to decorate this component class with this style, this template, etc. So you can see here, our component decorator, notice it is a function that is accepting an object is a parameter, and the selector, so this is what we use to attach it to the template and invoke it in our application. Template URL, style URLs, so this is actually an array that you can have more than one style sheet. I've never seen fit to do that, but you could if you wanted. And you can also do inline metadata. So when we get into component-driven architecture, we will leverage input and output heavily. So not only can you decorate the class, but you can decorate individual properties for fun and profit. All right, so class, template, how do they talk? How are they connected? Well, this is data binding. So data binding allows data to flow from the template to the class and vice versa. And so we have a few different types of binding: interpolation, property, event, and two-way binding. And the binding syntax, on the other hand, with Angular has expanded a little bit, but what this allowed us to do is, by expanding our binding syntax, we were able to create more meaningful bindings while reducing the API of the framework itself. So in a nutshell, there's 4 of them. Most people are familiar with the double braces. So this is just basic string interpolation, meaning it is just going to render simple strings in your template. If you wanted to pass a property from a class into the template and then possibly into another like subcomponent, you do that via property binding. If you wanted to capture an event from a template and then handle it in the class, you use event binding. And if you want to do both, so two-way data binding is, you'll notice that property binding goes one way, it's a one-way street, and event binding goes the other way. And what happens if you take 2 one-way streets and you put them together side by side? You have a two-way street, which is exactly how ng model works, is that it is allowing for when you update it in the component class, it renders in the template, but because forms and filling in forms are essentially a bidirectional activity and is mutative by nature, we need to be able to capture that and update our component class. So this is where this two-way binding comes in. More on that later. And so we can just think of it this way, that you have a class, it's passing properties or values into the template via property binding, and then if something happens in the template, we capture that via event binding. And you can see here at the top, we have some string interpolation. We're just rendering title, body. And so this is, again, I want to render a string, and that's as far as it goes, that you can't actually pass a value into a child component. That's not what it's designed for. On the other hand, if I wanted to pass an experiment, so you can see in the second line, I'm binding to experiment, and I'm going to pass in, as I'm iterating over the experiments, I want to pass that into the experiment component. That's how that is done. So we're basically passing a property or a value from the class into the template, and then ideally into a subcomponent. And then you'll notice on the bottom here we have a button that we're capturing a click event, and then we're using that to update the message. And then you will see two-way data binding, ng model. This is where it's on input, so that whatever's in your component class gets rendered into the form, but as you update it, it then gets rendered back. All right, so real quick, what about directives? This was a major piece that when you were doing 1.x, it was what happened to directives, because everything now is component-based. Well, they still exist, and we still use them a lot, whether we realize it or not, that a component is basically a directive with a template. So if you need to do something that has functionality, but it doesn't require a template, rather it needs to just act on a pre-existing element on the page, this is where a directive comes in. So I don't know if you knew this, but the blink tag was deprecated many years ago, and I think it's a tragedy. And I think it's only a matter of time before, some hipster brings it back, and I'm going to tell you how to do that with a Angular directive called blink. So we could create a class called blinker that takes an element, and then you would just do something. So notice it doesn't have a template, but it takes the element ref that you're working with, and you can do all sorts of things. So somebody could, if they wanted, resurrect the blink tag if you wanted, and make anything and everything blink.
Is there any concept of a virtual DOM in Angular like there is in React?
Not in the sense of React, no. So I would say stylistically or philosophically, this is where I think Angular and React converge the most. Whereas you have virtual DOM in React, where it's taking everything and then constructing essentially this virtual DOM that is then being rendered. Angular, on the other hand, they have decided to, or really leverage the core functionality of HTML as much as possible. So the answer is there a concept of virtual DOM in Angular? The answer is no. Instead of pulling away from the DOM, the Angular team is for the most part kind of leaned into it, which is why you're essentially binding up to like native DOM elements, etc.
Is component extended from directive?
If we go into some code here, I'm going to show you just a bit of a tip. One of the reasons why I like TypeScript is that a lot of times I can click into something and I can see here that component extends directive. So the answer is absolutely yes. So the question is, does component extend directive? It does, and I think what they've done is taken all the directive functionality and they say, we're taking this, but we're just going to allow somebody to attach a template to it. So this is really handy, and I recommend if you have a question about something, just going and clicking into it and seeing what's available. So I spent a lot of time command clicking into like these core type definitions. And so if somebody asks, like, does component extend directive? My first thought was like, well, maybe, I don't know. Well, that's really easy to find out. You can just click, and you can see here that it does indeed do that. So really, really good question. So the question is it good practice to programmatically render a component in Angular? And the answer is, until Angular 13, which is where we are, it was really hard to do that. And so one of the things that was really easy to do in 1.x was to dynamically render a component on the DOM. With Angular 13, you can now programmatically render components on the DOM. And by that, just to clarify, is there are situations where maybe the underlying data structure is the same, but the representation of that based on some kind of a type might be differently. And so being able to determine the type and then say, okay, I'm going to attach or instantiate this component into the DOM based on this, that would be a use case, but that would be, I would say, the exception and not the rule. So the answer is it a good idea? I would say in most cases you don't need to programmatically render your components in terms of dynamically attaching them to the DOM. Is that more often than not, you can just attach the template or your component into a template and it gets rendered that way. But there are cases where you might need to do that, but it's not very often.